Tonight, the worst is yet to come after Russian forces capture the largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Russia ramping up its siege on Ukrainian cities.
But if conflict comes to us, we're ready for it, and we will defend every inch of NATO territory.
And the heart-wrenching scene. Families torn apart with more than 1 million refugees fleeing Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine pushes oil prices even higher.
The last time I filled it up was about 110.
Lawmakers are looking for ways to ease the burden. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The war in Europe worsening by the day as Russia tightens its grip on Ukraine. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. Tonight, the Kremlin continues its assault on Ukraine with full military might. Even with Russia's economy crumbling under increased sanctions from the West, the ruble trading at a penny and the Russian stock market closed. The relentless attack on Ukraine is ramping up. As the war in Ukraine rages on, one positive development, Ukraine and Russia have agreed to a humanitarian corridor for civilians, even as breakthrough on a ceasefire remains elusive. As for the U.S., America and its Western allies remain adamant. NATO is not considering establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Today, the Secretary of State reiterating that point.
That could lead to a full-fledged war. In Europe, President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia. We're seeing them use increasingly brutal methods, including going at civilians and civilian populations. So I think the terrible expectation is that the suffering we've already seen is likely to get worse before it gets better.
Today, Russia blocked access to Facebook, threatening up to 15 years in prison for those who speak out against the war in Ukraine. All this in the wake of an emergency meeting today, the United Nations Security Council gathering together after Russian forces captured Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant, calling military operations around the nuclear site not only unacceptable, but highly irresponsible. A fire broke out after Kremlin troops shelled the plant in the dark of night, raising fears of a nuclear disaster that could affect Europe for decades. Fortunately, the fire was put out and the reactor not damaged. But some of the Ukrainian troops defending the plant were killed in the siege. Tonight, fighting remains intense throughout many southern cities along the coast. Well, the humanitarian crisis is growing by the day in Ukraine. More than 1.2 million people have fled to neighboring countries, many of them passing through the western city of Lviv. As CBN's George Thomas shows us, the Christian community is helping in a big way.
It's a wrenching scene playing out across Ukraine. Husbands like Pavlo forced to say goodbye to his wife and 2-year-old daughter Maria as they boarded a bus here in Lviv bound for Poland to escape Russia's invasion.
It's terrible because actually it was so unexpected and nobody was prepared to this situation.
And so many of them are arriving here in Lviv, in the western part of the country. And I mean, you just look, they're coming with just a suitcase, a duffel bag. And my understanding is that Ukrainian men are not allowed to board the trains from Kyiv to Lviv. Anybody between the ages of 18 and 60 is not allowed to get on the train because the government says they need them. They need them to fight.
This time we will have the volunteers and we will do what we can do here in Lviv.
Not far from Lviv's main train station, 3 ladies who escaped the fighting this week and never knew each other before this moment
cheese, some sausage.
Found shelter in Anastasia Mochar's tiny apartment, which she shares with her brother.
I don't know how long I'm going to be here because it's really hard to make plans.
Anna Tikhanchenko is from Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, where Russian forces bombarded City Hall Tuesday.
It's really hard to listen to the news and see the photo of neighborhoods, the places where I hang out. To see them destroyed is so sad.
Like so many residents here in Lviv, 22-year-old Anastasia Mochar, a Ukrainian Christian, decided to open her home to the young ladies, even though she didn't know them.
This is totally normal for me, because I was raised in a family where our home was open to other people. We were always helping people who were going through difficult times.
This past weekend, Mochar's church turned all available office space into temporary rooms for refugee families.
There will be a lot more refugees coming. We are not sure what's going to happen next, but the Christian community here stands ready to help, provide shelter, and anything else we can do.
The United Nations is warning the ongoing exodus could grow to as many as 5 million in the weeks ahead. George Thomas, CBN News, Lviv, Ukraine.
And happening this weekend, a live prayer event with George and a Ukrainian pastor. It's tomorrow, March 5th at 11 a.m. Eastern. You can sign up by going to cbn.com/pray4Ukraine. Well, our next guest is the father of 3 adopted children from Ukraine and the vice president of engagement at Lifeline Children's Services. Dr. Rick Morton, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate you being here. You, of course, know the situation well. Talk to us about the vulnerable state of orphans right now in Ukraine.
Well, Jenna, what we recognize is that orphans are among the most vulnerable people in any society, and that's on a day when things are normal. We know that in a crisis where literally millions of people have been made more vulnerable and are fleeing for their lives, that those that are orphaned, widows, those that the Bible tells us are a part of those vulnerable classes that we in the church are supposed to care for, they become even more vulnerable. The truth is that they're voiceless, and they're probably not in the mainstream of society, and so we have great fear for what's happening to the orphans in Ukraine, and ultimately how this war will affect them, not just today, but literally for months and years to come.
We're seeing all of these reports of refugees fleeing, over 1 million now. I think it's 1.2. A lot more to come. How will all of these people fleeing, how will that affect children without families?
Well, we've heard reports coming from inside of Ukraine in places where orphanages are short-staffed, where orphanages have not been given permission by the government in order to be able to move children to seek to evacuate or to seek refugee status out of the country. In many cases, the caregivers have left and abandoned their post out of fear for their own safety, and so as I said, there are consequences for this, and orphans are not in a position where they can really help themselves. We've seen in the body of Christ around. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead and finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say, we've seen in countries around that there are people in churches that are ready to receive orphans, ready to receive vulnerable peoples, and to care for them. The problem that we face at this point is there's a very uncertain pathway to those children being able to get to that help.
Yeah. There are reports tonight of Ukraine and Russia agreeing to humanitarian corridors for civilians. Does that give you any kind of hope for the situation in Ukraine?
It really does. I think that in the midst of the crisis, and even as we've seen President Zelensky and other officials that have presented themselves on the subject, one of the things that we would just want to remind them is that they have to give permission in order for those that are in state care to be able to seek that relief. And so we pray in the days to come that in greater numbers, orphans will be allowed to be mobilized out of the country. We here at Lifeline are not only praying for that, but we're ready for it. We have partners that are on the ground in the countries surrounding Ukraine who are standing ready. They have facilities available. There's food there. There's clothing there. There are people there to help that are literally awaiting the arrival of orphan and vulnerable children and those that care for them. And we've seen the church make a mighty move during this to really live out the fruit of the gospel. And so we pray that ultimately the Ukrainian government will make that possible.
All right, Rick Morton with Lifeline Christian Services, thank you for the work you're all doing, and thank you for joining us tonight. The best to you and your family.
Thank you, Jenna.
Well, to the economy, a strong new jobs report with more jobs added to the U.S. economy last month than expected. Unemployment, too, falling to a new pandemic low. The jobs growth coming even amid the threats of rising oil prices and looming federal interest rate hikes. Last month, employers added 678,000 jobs. The expectation, only 440,000. That is the strongest job growth seen in 7 months. And unemployment fell to 3.8%, down from 4%, a month earlier. Hourly wage gains at a historic high did cool off from the previous month, up 5.1%, but still not enough to keep up with soaring inflation rates. And joining us now, Julia Manchester, political reporter with The Hill. Julia, welcome. Happy Friday. So let's start there with the economy. You know, encouraging news for the jobs picture. Politically, though, how much does that help the Biden administration, given the sky-high inflation we're seeing?
Yeah, very encouraging numbers, and I think you can expect the Biden administration as well as Democrats on the ballot in November to really tout these numbers, to say that these are a result of Biden's recovery policies coming out of the pandemic, or at least coming out of the stage of the pandemic we're in. But you're right, Jenna. I think this is still tricky for the Biden administration because while more Americans have jobs and the unemployment rate is low, Americans are still having to pay more at the grocery store, more to buy a home, more for gas. So it's something that they're going to have to deal with and try to message around, but it's still a political issue for them.
Some welcome news for the White House, Julia. New polling from NPR showing President Biden getting a boost from his State of the Union speech. The poll has him up 8 points at 47% approval. A question, do you think this is from the State of the Union and what he said that night, or does it have to do more with what's happening in Ukraine right now?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think when we look at what's happening in Ukraine, there is in general a feeling of unity among Americans towards what's happening, viewing Vladimir Putin as a villain in this, being against Russia's invasion to Ukraine, standing together in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. I mean, when you just look at the acts of kindness and the acts of charity that are coming from the U.S. and other Western nations going towards Ukraine, and really around the world, I should say, going towards Ukraine, that's unity in itself. However, looking at Tuesday's State of the Union address, I mean, it was amazing to see that bipartisan round of applause at the mention of solidarity with Ukraine and Biden very much condemning Putin. This is something where Republicans and Democrats, for the most part, are very much on the same page. And I think we're getting a bit of a rally around the flag moment here. At the same time, though, that's not to say that this is, a completely bipartisan issue and that Biden is, facing no political hurdles here. There is right now bipartisan pressure for Biden to put a ban or a sanction, I should say, on Russian oil. You have figures like Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, calling for that ban, and you also have staunch Republicans calling for that ban as well, while the White House is not ruling it out, but sort of trying to distance themselves from that idea, saying that could lead to higher gas prices. So there's still criticisms from Republicans, Democrats, and the American people towards how the Biden administration is handling certain aspects of this crisis and this invasion. But in general, I think in the moment, it's a boost for Biden.
All right, Julia Manchester, a political reporter with The Hill. We'll leave it there this Friday. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
And coming up, more than 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine. And here at home, gas prices are spiking. What's being done about it? More than 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine as Russia intensifies its attacks. Here at home, gas prices are spiking as oil prices skyrocket. Dale Hurd has the story.
Ukrainian officials are now reporting more than 2,000 casualties as Russia continues to shell major cities, including civilian areas.
These aren't military targets. They are places where civilians work and families live. This is shameful.
Representative Victoria Sparks has family and friends in Ukraine.
This is barbaric and brutal to the level of unbelievable. They are bombing non-stop civilians, non-stop, from morning till night.
The International Criminal Court's prosecutor has announced an investigation into war crimes. The Russian army has reportedly taken the strategic port city of Kherson, the first large Ukrainian city to fall, and have 4 major Ukrainian cities surrounded. A massive Russian convoy 17 miles north of the capital Kyiv seems to have stalled. The war in Ukraine also continues to push oil prices higher to $120 a barrel today, levels not seen since the Obama years. And it's hitting Americans squarely in the pocketbook.
The last time I filled it up was about 110.
I'm going to pay right now for 30 gallons, this $120. Oh, $150. It's $5 each gallon.
Not only is our energy bill up, but our grocery bill is up. Our gas for our vehicles, that's up as well.
In his State of the Union address, Joe Biden said he would release 30 million barrels from the strategic oil reserve to bring down prices. But critics call that a small Band-Aid on a misguided energy policy that has again made America dependent on foreign oil.
You know, he's releasing 1.5 days oil supply for the United States. 1.5 days. Well, that's not a strategy.
And even as the U.S. uses economic sanctions to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, it continues to indirectly fund the Russian war machine by continuing to buy Russian oil at much higher prices.
The difference is more than paying for the war. So you can talk about all these sanctions, but all Putin has to do is look at the bank account, and every morning the U.S. is buying more Russian oil.
Last year, the U.S. bought almost 250 million barrels of Russian oil. At today's oil price, that's almost $30 billion into the Russian economy annually.
In just 13 months, we've gone from a country that was exporting oil to one that now has to depend on our enemies for our energy. That's a very dangerous predicament.
Economist Stephen Moore.
We have 250 years worth of natural gas. We have 500 years worth of coal. We have 150 years worth of oil. We're not running out of it. We just need to drill for it. And that's not happening right now. And that is unfortunately playing into the hands of our enemies.
Just last week, the White House put new restrictions on building liquefied natural gas terminals in the United States and put a moratorium on new energy leases on federal lands. And one of the first things Joe Biden did as president was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline project. But it is a much more serious situation for the Ukrainian people. The UN says 1 million have fled Ukraine for neighboring nations since Russia invaded the country a week ago, setting off the fastest exodus of refugees in this century. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Adding to America's fuel woes, inflation at every level of the economy at a 40-year high. When we come back, how some lawmakers are trying to ease the burden. With inflation at a 40-year high, consumers are paying more on everyday necessities like gas, electricity, and groceries. Democrats at the federal level are trying to pass legislation to combat the rising costs, but in the meantime, state lawmakers are stepping in and finding ways to provide some temporary relief. Caitlin Burke has the story.
Governors across the country are working to help people with the crushing weight of inflation, even if the fix is only temporary.
Lawmakers are very aware that inflation is eroding people's ability to pay. It's making a big difference for people. And a lot of lawmakers see tax policy as a way to address this problem.
Some governors are proposing tax rebates of up to $500, while others are looking to eliminate the sales tax on groceries or put a freeze on state gas taxes. Jared Walczak with the Tax Foundation says it's a bipartisan effort.
Republican lawmakers have been far more likely to focus on income tax cuts. They talk about the competitive advantage of businesses being able to invest at a lower cost, of driving people into the state rather than out of the state. Democratic lawmakers have been more likely to focus on sales tax rate reductions and providing relief during consumption.
Congress is also working to pass legislation they hope will provide more lasting relief.
You know, when I go fill up my gas tank, it's almost $5, and the price of groceries has gone up. So this is why we need to put more money in the pockets of the working class.
Congressman Ro Khanna told CBN News the Biden administration has a plan, and now it's time for Congress to act.
I mean, the prescription drug bill would be a big deal, to have Medicare negotiate to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. We all know the experience of having to pay too much out of pocket for drugs. The second thing is, again, the earned income tax credit expansion, or getting more money in the pockets of working families. And the third thing is looking at some gas tax holiday.
Republicans argued that Democrats' spending plans and policies are part of the reason for the soaring prices.
They were warned that spending trillions would lead to soaring inflation. They were told that their anti-energy policies would send gas prices to new heights. But they plowed ahead anyway, raising the price at the pump by 50% and pushing inflation to a 40-year high.
Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says the war in Ukraine could drive inflation even higher. However, the central bank is still planning to move forward with a series of interest rate increases over the next year. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
And still ahead, one of the youngest to flee Ukraine just days after her birth. We'll tell you how next. Finally tonight, a perilous escape. Over 1 million refugees fleeing from the war-torn country of Ukraine. But one couple went into the danger zone on an important mission. Jessica and Jacob Beckman traveled to Ukraine to pick up their daughter, baby Vivian, born to a Ukrainian surrogate mother in Kyiv just the day before Russia invaded. And at just a few days old, Vivian and her parents fled to the Polish border. With the help of a hired driver, the trio made it 27 hours west before continuing their trip by foot, battling 30-degree weather and trying to keep baby Vivian warm. The couple says they did question their decision at one point, but after a brief separation, the family made it safely back to their home in sunny California. The new parents saying they couldn't be more grateful or feel more fortunate for this new gift. We're glad they made it out okay and that baby Vivian is doing well. She's adorable. Well, that's going to do it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday.